I think to get the full grasp of the story from the book of Kings, our first reading, you got to kind of like roll back a little bit to find the full setting. And so if you roll back a little bit, you get an incredible description of murderous palace intrigues and short monarchy reigns until finally King Ahab ascends the throne. And the first thing we learn about Ahab is he marries a woman who's not Hebrew, which is problematic back then. A woman named Jezebel. She's entered common imagination. And then the second thing he does is build a whole lot of temples and shrines to a particular false god. And we learn that, culture starts from the top, right? And so all of Israel just kind of goes along with it. They begin worshiping at all the high places, following all these false gods, and then most of God's prophets go along also. And our poor friend Elijah is left feeling extremely out of step. He's looking at all of his fellow prophets and wondering if they've sort of lost their minds and gone off, and he doesn't know what to do with all of it. Everyone seems to have just kind of gone mad. And so God isn't all that pleased either with people's choices to choose against the law and against God. And so through the prophet Elijah, God decrees that there will be a drought, and it will last until God says there won't be a drought. That makes Elijah very popular, as you can imagine. So to save his life, God sends him to a river and feeds him by ravens. It's a pretty famous story, you may know it. And so Elijah is by the river, but Elijah is all by himself. And I wonder how that is for Elijah. Sometimes being by yourself and so isolated isn't always the best, and your head kind of gets the best of you. And so I wonder what Elijah feels. Like, is he enraged because Ahab and Jezebel are cruel people, and they're leading all of Israel astray, and so he's boiling mad, and he throws rocks in the river in a sense of futile rage? Does he pace up and down the river? Because why is he here? Like, why has he been sent away? Now he has no voice to sort of change anything that's happening in his home city. Or does he sit down by the waters and weep? Because there are people who are just trying to do what they're trying to do, and now their crops are wilted, and now their children are crying. Or Elijah's a prophet. So maybe he takes all of that and takes it into his deepest center, to the place where God really is within him, and lays it all out before God, and reminds himself that his center of gravity is really the Holy One. And it's in times like these that he needs to figure out who he really is, so he can be the real prophet of God that he's called to be. He's there for a while. And eventually the water dries up. So absent a source of water, he's got to go somewhere else. And what I think is interesting is that God doesn't send him off to another river to be fed by, like, crows. Instead, God sends him to find this widow and her son. And I think that's really intentional, right? God could have sent him out be by himself, but he sends Elijah to another human being. Because maybe it's not been great for Elijah just out there with the corvids. Maybe there's, like, a problem with that. Because we know a couple of chapters later on, Elijah goes to the mountain, and what is the primary thing he complains to God about? That he is alone. So maybe Elijah's had enough alone time. And so God sends him to this widow, who's having her own struggles. She's at the city gate in a dry and arid land, suffering from drought, collecting tiny, bitter, dried up sticks. When Elijah, she sees him on the horizon. And he walks closer, and he looks like a prophet. And he's probably known, right? You can't sort of tell off the king and then not have word travel, even back then, even after, absent social media. People talk to each other. He's known as a prophet. And he looks at her and he says, I really need some water. And by the way, I'd really like some food. And she turned to get him the water, but at the request of food, it's just a little too much. Like, they're all suffering a drought here, and does he really think she has anything of her own to give him in this moment? And so can't you see her, the mother of this child that's going to die, turn around and be like, look, buddy, do you see my basket of dry sticks? I have enough oil and enough meal to make a cake for me and my kiddo, and then we're going to go sit under some kind of bush and call it quits because your God has caused a drought. And you can hear in her voice, she doesn't trust Elijah, she doesn't trust God. And Elijah says to her, do not be afraid. Like, how many times does that occur in Scripture? Do not be afraid. This woman has plenty to be afraid of. She's afraid that if she gives her last morsel, that not only ends her life, but it makes her a terrible parent. She's afraid that this prophet, he's a charlatan. He's afraid that, she's afraid that, like, this God who caused this drought isn't really as good as this God seemed to be. She's a foreigner, right? She lives in this land. She's also afraid maybe that God, if God is actually who God says, doesn't see her suffering, doesn't see her son suffering, doesn't seem to care one iota about it. And now she's afraid that this God is asking her to give up more than she knows how to give. That she doesn't know how to be who this God, through this prophet, might be calling her to be in this moment. What if she's just not enough? What if God is too much? So she looks at the prophet for a long time. And then she turns on her heel and walks. And walks back to her house, and Elijah follows her because God has sent him to her. And so he follows her, and she dumps her sticks in the fire pit. And she strikes the flint, and she makes a little fire. She disappears into her house, and she brings back out the pan full of the tiny dough that she has left. And she cooks it on the fire. And I wonder if she doesn't know until she does it that she's actually going to give it to Elijah. In the way that you don't know, because the decision is so big, you don't know what you're going to do until the final second. And she gives it to him. And she watches him take a bite, and something drops in her belly. Because what if she's a fool? What if God isn't making the promise that there'll be enough to eat? And so she walks back into the kitchen and summons all the courage she requires. Sets her pan down and takes a deep breath. And picks up the stone jug of oil. And it feels pretty lightweight, but it's felt lightweight for days. And quickly she tips it up and almost doesn't want to look. Because if nothing runs out of it, there is no food. But she tips it up and out pours the oil. And the oil was not there earlier. And it's enough. Not a ton, it's enough. And she opens with trepidation the canister, and there's meal. And it was empty before. And she mixes the smallest of cakes, but as she does so, it suddenly hits her the reality of what has happened, and her knees buckle. And she doesn't know if she's falling to her knees in prayer or in relief, but does it matter? And maybe they're the same thing. And she makes a small cake for herself and for her son. And it's enough. It's enough. In the dry and in the arid land, this small community forms. This foreign widow and her son, and this random prophet, they stay together for a period of time. A kind of community of solidarity in a desiccated landscape. And they kind of need each other. And maybe Elijah wishes there were more prophets. Maybe he wishes he had some colleagues that would support him in this, but it's not the season for that. And maybe the widow wishes her garden would actually grow so she could actually feed her son some proper vegetables, but it's not the time for that. But they're together, this strange community. And it's interesting, their problems aren't solved. The drought is still happening. Ahab and Jezebel are still doing their thing. But the oil doesn't run out. The water jug is full. They have enough. And I think maybe that is the truth. That in the absolute most difficult times of our lives, whatever those are, whenever they are, God calls us to community. God calls us to unexpected relationships of solidarity. Because God sees. And then, it might not be what we want, but there is a sufficient amount of oil, and the water, it never runs out.